Our talk today is based on the experience of Joe Lukas, Vice President of PMCentersUSA. Joe is a recognized expert in project management subject areas such as risk management, scheduling, estimating, and earned value, and is a frequent guest speaker for companies and organizations across the country. Today's presentation will run about 30 minutes long and will be followed by a question and answer session. But now, let me turn the presentation over to Joe.
All right, thank you, Justine, and let's get started. What we're going to talk about today are the mistakes that people make when using risk management. And this is really based on reviews I've done for clients looking at the risk management plans they've put in place. And I'm seeing the same mistakes made over and over again. So I'm going to talk about what these mistakes are. And I'll also talk about some best practices for applying risk management to your projects. So a show of hands, how many people have used risk management on a project? Okay, see Tony, Dave, Jack Lee, Kevin, seeing a lot of hands going up. Okay, great. Looks like almost, oh wow, a good portion of the group is raising their hands. That's good to see. Now, here's another question, another show of hands. How many people feel they did it successfully? Show of hands on that one. How many feel they did it right? Okay, again, I'm seeing a lot of hands going up, so that's good news. So, for those folks who have used it, let's go through this webinar and see if you're making any of the mistakes I'm going to talk about today. All right, let me run through the list real quickly, and then I'm going to go back and talk about each of these in more detail. Now, I do want to point out these are in no specific order as far as frequency of occurrence or severity of occurrence. So here's my top 10. The first one, not considering opportunities, just the threats on projects. Number 2 is confusing causes, risk events, and impacts. Number 3 is using checklists and not looking around, scanning the horizon for other risks. Number 4 is underestimating the impacts of risk and not scaling them based on project drivers. I'll explain what that means. Number 5 is not using 100% probability. That may sound a little strange. We'll explain why you would do something like that. All right, let's go through the other 5. Number 6, not considering sensitivity when you do risk analysis. Number 7, this is calling risk response planning mitigation planning. Number 8, not considering contingency plans along with risk response plans. Number 9, not making team members responsible for specific risk. And number 10 is not making risk management an ongoing process. So there's my top 10. And again, the rest of this webinar, I'm going to go through and talk about each of these specifically. Well, let's start with the first one. I see this happen all the time. Organizations look at risk management as being bad things that can happen on a project. And it's unfortunate because if you look at the definition of risk, go to the dictionary.com, and it talks about chancy, hazardous events. So the definition talks about bad things. But in reality, risk management is identifying, analyzing, responding to all risk. And the point is, risk can be either positive or negative, adverse or positive. So risk management is all about the opportunities and the threats on your project. And most organizations don't consider the opportunities, and that's a huge failing. What I'm showing here is a client that we worked with, and the good news, they did have a procedure for doing risk management, so congratulations on that. A lot of organizations don't. But the bad news was their procedure was all about the bad things that could happen on a project. There was absolutely nothing in that procedure about looking for opportunities and trying to take advantage of opportunities. So this is the point. Don't look at just the threats. Ask the question, are there opportunities on this project that we can take advantage of? Risk management really looks at both. All right, here's the second mistake. And this one is confusing risk causes, risk events, and impacts. And the classic on this one, this goes back early in my career. And I was just assigned as project manager for a project in China. So it's a big project. It was a joint venture with the Chinese government, building a chemicals plant. And I was telling my neighbor about it because I was heading over to China to start negotiations on the contract. And he said to me, he said, wow, that's a huge risk. And this was back in 1986. Now back then, China had just opened up to the West. Again, a very closed culture. And quite frankly, there was a lot of discussion within our company about, well, if we do this project, what's going to stop the Chinese from just taking the plant over and kicking us out? That was a huge concern. But my neighbor said to me, he says, wow, that's a huge risk. And my response was, no, it's not. Because it wasn't. See, the difference is that when you talk about risk, there's three elements to it. The first are causes. These are definitive facts that exist on your project and give rise to uncertainty. My neighbor was wrong. The decision was made. Our company senior management made the decision. We are doing this project in China because they saw it as a huge market and they had to get into that market. The decision was made. It led to risk events. I mean, obviously, one risk event was the Chinese government seizing the plant after it was done and kicking us out. That was a risk event. Another one, quite frankly, was the fact that we were importing some equipment and it may not get out of customs. The Chinese could just hold it in customs and not release it. So we had a significant number of risk events we identified, but when you do risk management, you got to separate causes, which are facts that exist, from the actual risk events. And risk events have uncertainty. They may or may not happen. Now, the third part is the impacts. Impacts are the unplanned variations from your project objectives which occur when the risk event occurs. So they're a direct result of the risk event happening. So this is the point. There are three parts to a risk: the causes, the risk events, and the impacts. The importance of this: when you start talking about risk response strategies, if you eliminate the causes, the risk event goes away. It can't exist. So that is one strategy for dealing with risk. I mean, obviously, we're going to talk about mitigation, about reducing the probability, the impact of the risk, and that's a valid technique. But avoidance is another one, and that's all about eliminating the causes. So this is so critical. When you identify risk, you want to identify all three elements: the causes, the risk events, and the impacts, because that allows you to really do complete planning around how to respond to the risk. All right, mistake number 3. Most organizations do repeat projects. They do very similar projects over and over again. And I'm a complete proponent of having checklists, because why not be efficient? Why reinvent the wheel? So checklists are good because they give you a list of typical risk events that occur on a project. But here's the problem. I've seen project teams use checklists, and they go down that list. Yes, no, no, yes, no, no, yes. We're done. And nobody asked the question, what else is out there that's not on the list? So I'm an advocate of always including brainstorming, taking time to ask the question, okay, folks, we went through the checklist. Now let's think about what else is out there on this project that could be a risk event that's not on the checklist. So be careful, because my experience is with some companies, you have a checklist and the team puts the blinders on, look at the checklist only, and don't think about what else is out there, i.e. scanning the horizon. Mistake number 4. Well, this one is all about understating the impacts of a risk or not looking at the impacts based on project drivers. Now, in reality, there's really 4 impacts to any risk event, up to 4. It could be a cost impact, a schedule impact, functionality, quality. And you need to look at the largest impact in all 4 areas. Now, the point is, not all projects have the same drivers. So when you look at a project risk, you've got to ask the question, what's the driver for the project? What's most important? Now what I'm showing here is a starting point. This one is looking at the 4 impacts, and it's pretty much weighing them the same. But think about specific projects, and let me pick on one called the Y2K. Remember going from 1999 to the year 2000? There was a huge concern with most companies around computers, because at the time, the dates did not have the 4 digits for the year. So going to the year 2000 was a huge issue. Now, at that point, quite frankly, what was happening is companies were throwing money at service companies and consultants to fix the problems. So if you had a risk event that had a high cost for the Y2K project, who cares? If you had a schedule risk, that was huge, because again, there was a definitive deadline. When 12/31/1999 rolled around, that was it. When those clocks went to the year 2000, it's too late. So obviously, schedule impacts were much more important than cost impacts around the Y2K project. So this is the point. I see project teams doing risk management, and nobody's asked the question, what's most important on this project? Is it cost? Is it schedule? Is it functionality? Is it quality? What is the driver for the project? So you really need to establish that. Then when you start looking at the impacts, understand which ones are most important based on the project drivers. Mistake number 5, not using 100% probability during planning. Now, I said earlier, risk events have uncertainty. 100% is not uncertainty. It's a fact, right? So that seems sort of like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth. But let me give you an example of this one. I did a project. This was a custom-built software project. And it impacted plants for this company around the world: Australia, China, England, France, U.S., Brazil, Canada. I mean, it impacted all their sites. And quite frankly, the company was extremely busy. And key personnel at the different sites were not available to talk to get requirements. So when we did our risk management, when we did the initial plan, I put in there that we had 100% probability of having incomplete requirements. I went to the sponsor. There was actually 3 sponsors in executive management. And I told them, I said, look, this is 100% probability. We will fail. So either we got 2 choices. Either we figure out a way to get requirements, or number 2, don't do the project. It's that simple. So obviously, using 100% probability gets attention. It becomes a showstopper, especially if it has a high impact. Now, what we did, we gave it the biggest impact of all, to 10, because, again, if you don't have complete requirements, you will have a schedule problem, a cost problem, functionality problem, quality problem. It impacts everything. So that was a showstopper, and it got the attention of senior management. And their answer was, we can't not do this project. We have to do it. You need to figure out a way to get requirements. And my response was, well, you need to work with me on this. Then we need to put a plan in place that's going to make these people available and make it a priority for them to deal with us to give us requirements. So I'm an advocate, where appropriate, of using 100% probability because, again, it gets attention. It states that either we solve this problem, i.e. this risk with 100%, or this job is not viable. Mistake number 6. This is not considering sensitivity with risk analysis. The problem you run into when you do risk analysis, you assign a probability, you assign an impact. Well, wait a minute. You're assigning point values, but really it's a range of potential outcomes. Now, on smaller projects, my feeling is, hey, that's okay. That's adequate. If you're dealing with a major project, that's not okay. You need to look at the sensitivity around the risk. And the only way I know of doing this one is using what's called Monte Carlo or risk simulation software. And I've done that on major projects. And what it does, it gives you more complete results and helps you determine what are the real big risks on this project that we need to deal with. It really helps the project team and management understand the project better. And most importantly, in my opinion, what it really does, it gives you the ability to decide on contingency amounts for both cost and schedule to manage the risk. You see, that's one reason for contingency, is because of risks, things that can happen. And using a risk simulation allows you to decide on how much contingency is needed for the level of comfort we need on this project. And risk simulation gives you 2 things. It gives you a histogram of potential outcomes for the project, and that can be time or money. You can do it for both. And it also gives you a cumulative cost or schedule with the overrun probabilities. So you can look at your analysis and say, okay, if we go with this completion date, we have a 50% chance of making it. If I add another month to the schedule, i.e. contingency, I go from 50% to 85%. That's my contingency I need. So risk simulation is something that should be done on all major projects because, again, using a standard risk analysis, looking at probability impact, you're looking at point values and not considering the sensitivities. Mistake number 7. Now, what I'm showing you here, this is actually a software product on the market today. And I've run across it twice now with clients, and it's wrong. They have in there, and I'm showing it here on the screen, a field called mitigation plan. Wow. No, it should be called the risk response plan. Mitigation is just one technique, and that's for threats. It doesn't address opportunities. It doesn't address things like transference or avoidance. So mitigation is very limiting. And it reinforces that concept of risk are threats and not opportunities. So be careful. I've seen this in procedures that companies have developed. Again, the software product right here. It is not mitigation plan. No, it's a risk response plan and it's a contingency plan. You need them both. The techniques for responding to risk, they're listed here. And as I said, mitigation is just one technique, and that's for threats. If you want, you can use avoidance. That's getting rid of the causes. If you do that, the risk event goes away. A transference is using a contracting mechanism to transfer the risk to somebody else. And then for opportunities, you have exploit, share, and enhance. And for both threats and opportunities, you have acceptance and contingency plans. So really make sure you're looking at all the potential methods for dealing with risk on your project. Don't limit your thinking to just mitigation. All right, mistake number 8. I've seen some templates in use by different companies, and some are pretty good, but I've seen several of them that talk about risk response plans and does not consider contingency plans. Now, the difference is risk response is getting into what are you going to do before the risk event occurs. And what you're really trying to do is you're trying to influence the probability and impact factors. For example, if it's a threat and you're dealing with mitigation, the actions you take should lower the probability and or the impact values. If it's an opportunity, what you want to do is increase the probability and impact values to make it more likely to happen. Now, contingency plans is different. This is, okay, if this risk event occurs, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? An example, again, I used to live in upstate New York, did a lot of projects with construction outside. Let's assume I had a project where we're building a brick wall, putting a brick wall on a building, and this is in early March. Well, early March in upstate New York, it can be quite nice, or it could be quite miserable. It could be snow, ice, sub-freezing temperatures. You just don't know. So a contingency plan would be arranging with local suppliers to have plastic sheeting and propane heaters available so I could build a shelter around the work area so we get that brick wall done, even if it's freezing temperatures. Now, obviously, if the weather is nice, which can happen, I don't need it, so I'm not going to do it unless it's needed. So I'm going to watch the weather forecast, and when it's time to do the work, if we see sub-freezing weather, the risk event's going to occur, which is bad weather. We'll implement the contingency plan. We'll get the plastic sheeting. We'll get the propane heaters, build the structure, and continue working. So this is the point. You got to consider both risk response plans and contingency plans. Now, the example I gave, the risk response plan would have been to say, okay, let's look at the schedule. Is there any way of postponing that work until May, when the weather's better, or even April, or move it up maybe till the preceding October? So can we move the schedule around to avoid the early March weather. All right, mistake number 9. Not making team members responsible for risks. It's not just the project manager. And I sat through a risk session once at a client site in Philadelphia. And it was kind of comical because, again, they went through develop risk response plans, and the project manager would say, well, who wants to take ownership of this one? Nobody answered. So he said, well, I'll take it. Got to the next one. Who's going to take ownership of this one? Nobody responded. Well, I'll take it. Well, that's not the way to do things. If you're the project manager, you should say, hey, this risk is tied to the technical solution. George, you're in charge of the technical team. I think you should own this risk. Do you agree? You always ask that question, do you agree? If the guy says no, why not? Let's talk about it. But your role as project manager is to manage the risk on the project working with your project team. So involve your project team. They should own the risk that apply to them. That's the point. Make them responsible. And you'll notice what I'm showing here, and that is a status column. This is a template that I like to use. It's pretty simple, pretty nice, because, again, we want to make sure we're looking at risk at each project team meeting about what's happening, what steps are you taking to deal with this risk as far as risk responses. And you'll notice right here we have listed the mitigation plans, contingency. Here's an avoidance down here. Here's a mitigation plan again. So the 3 examples I'm showing here are all threats, not opportunities. But again, the point being, you list the risk events, the plans for dealing with them, and the status of those plans. And then the other thing, too, is this. These values will change as you take actions. They're not static. They are dynamic values. So you ought to be looking at those and asking the question, is the risk exposure on this project going down? And the answer is it should be. So that's something else to look at. And that's outside the topic today, but you can actually calculate a score for the risk profile on a project. And theoretically, as you're taking advantage of the opportunities and dealing with the threats, the risk profile should become a lower number. All right, the final point. Risk management, it's an ongoing process, not a one-time event. And I had a project, this goes back a few years ago, where we were looking at the project. We were called in because it wasn't going well. And one of the questions we asked in a project review, are you using risk management? Oh, yeah, we did. Where is it? Well, basically, it was in a binder on a shelf, and it had a lot of dust on it. They did it. And what they did is they basically checked it off. They had a checklist on all their project stuff they had to do. So, yeah, we did risk management. We're done with it, and they put it aside. Well, no, it's an ongoing process. You do risk management early in the project and stay with it until the end of the job. And quite frankly, what I recommend is that risk management should be a standing agenda item at your meetings. My projects, typically 25% of the meeting is devoted to risk management. You want to ask the questions, are there any new risks on the horizon? Because they can occur. You could have new risks that develop. Have any risk triggers occurred? A trigger is an indication a risk event is about to happen or has happened. Where are we on the status of our risk plans? What's been done? What are the values of probability and impact based on the actions we've taken? And how effective have the actions been in managing the risk? So it should be an ongoing dialogue with the project team around risk management. The way I would say it is simply this. When you look at your schedule, you do schedule updates, right? Well, by the same token, you've got to do risk updates because it's something you have to manage over the life of the project, just like your schedule. All right, in conclusion, I hope this helps you realize some of the mistakes that can be made in dealing with risk on your project. I covered my top 10 things to watch out for. I would recommend that if your company does not have it in place, you should develop a risk management procedure with templates supporting it for your company. Do not leave it up to each project manager to invent the process and or the tools. Don't. It's not a good way to go. Now, there are software packages available on the market for doing risk management. If you got one, that's great. But have something. Have something in place. It can be as simple as an Excel workbook. That works great too. I have one that I use, a nice little template for doing identification, analysis, and risk response planning, and then also to status the risk on the project. So get your project managers on the same page. Have them do risk management the same way on all your projects. All right. We went through this pretty quickly today. This is just an introduction to some of the top mistakes that people make. We do have a course, and actually it's coming up in May and then again in October, around key concepts for project risk management. And this course, it covers 2 sessions, 2 3-hour sessions with homework. It's a great course because you'll be an expert on risk management coming out of that thing. Now, we do not spend a lot of time on things like Monte Carlo. That's an advanced class, but you will understand how to identify risk, how to quantify risk, how to respond to risk when you take this class. So if you're looking to improve your skills, this is the way to do it. All right, with that, let me turn it back over to Justine.
All right. Thank you, Joe. Looks like we have a few questions here from our audience. First question, someone says, you mentioned contingency plans to be activated only if a risk actually happens. Could you give an example of this?
Well, I'll give you one example around using plastic sheeting, propane heaters. When you're dealing with a brick wall in the middle of bad weather. Another example, I'll give you another example, one that happened on one of my projects. I had a very sharp engineer on the project, excellent person, great person, and I was approached by management, and they said, look, George, that was the guy's name, highly regarded. We have a supervisory position opening up in about 3 months, and we'd like to put George on this position. Not 100% for sure yet, because again, a couple other things have to happen to make this position open, but we want to give you an advance warning that this could happen. Okay, great. It may or may not happen, so it's a risk event. The contingency plan, I don't need to do anything unless it does happen. Now, the contingency plan obviously is finding the right resources to backfill for George in order to not lose any time on in our schedule. So I need a contingency plan. Now, quite frankly, if you want to talk about risk response planning mitigation, well, what I could have done is something like go to George and say, hey, I heard about this potential opportunity. Boy, that's a terrible job to take. You don't want to do that. Wow, the headaches you'd suffer. You know, I could have tried to influence a person to stay on the job, or I could have taken the approach that my job was more important than that supervisory position. And I actually had that situation once on one project where it was a very critical project for the company, and a person was being considered for a promotion, and I went to upper management and I said, this can't happen. This project is too important, so I can't allow it. I cannot afford to lose this person. If I do, here's the consequences. And quite frankly, in that situation, management agreed and said there'll be other opportunities, but yeah, we agree with you. This project is too critical to the company. That person cannot be moved. So that, in that case, was a risk response dealing with the threat of losing that key person. The other example I gave with George, where it was a good opportunity, and I had a backfill plan. That's a contingency plan because if he did leave, I wanted to be able to backfill for him, and I was able to.
All right.
There's a note here from Andrea I want to address. It says 100% probability isn't just a risk, it's an issue. I disagree, Andrea. I disagree with you. A risk event that has occurred is an issue by definition. And the reason I wanted to address that question, I kind of chuckled at it. I actually saw a company that had a risk register and then a separate issues log. They kept two of them. And my question was, why are you doing that? Because it should be the same log. So by definition, a risk event that occurred is an issue. Now, the 100% probability, again, what I said, if you don't deal with it, yes, it will happen, and then yes, therefore, it's an issue. But the example I gave around the requirements, not getting complete requirements, again, we were able to do something during project planning to cut that down from 100% probability to something less than that. So we took actions to cut that down. So, Andrea, thanks for bringing that point up. That's a good point, and I wanted to address that. So thanks again.
Okay, we have time for one more question, Joe. Someone says, I'm a bit confused. You said risks are uncertain, but then you said risk causes are facts and not uncertain. Can you explain this?
Yeah, again, there's three parts to a risk, three parts. The causes are facts that exist on your project that lead to risk events. That's the point. Risk events have the uncertainty. They may or may not happen. Let me give you another example. Buying equipment. Now, this is one that happened to me. All right. I'm buying equipment from Germany because that's where we get it from. The specific type of equipment made by a German company. That's a fact. I'm going to buy the equipment from this company in Germany. The company name, by the way, was Comp, because they had the best equipment and we needed their specific equipment. That's a fact. The uncertainty was the exchange rates, because again, we were paying for the equipment upon delivery, and the exchange rates can go up or down. So it could be a threat or an opportunity, or it may not change at all. So you see, there's uncertainty. I have no idea, but this was like 9 months between order and delivery. I had no idea what's going to happen to exchange rates. Now, again, I mean, there are online sources available that project what's going to happen to exchange rates, but yeah, good luck with that one, because the projection can be wrong, right? They can be. So, you see the difference? A cause is a fact. And in the example I gave, buying that equipment from Germany was a fact. We already made that decision. But the uncertainty was the exchange rates, and that's the risk event, because it could go up or down, so it could be a threat or an opportunity. Now, the impact, obviously, is a cost impact to our budget.
All right, thank you, Joe. If anyone else has questions that we weren't able to get to today, please send us an email at pmtraining@PMCentersUSA.com, and we will provide an answer for you.